We make economic decisions every day. Decide when it's best to buy a home, select which investment or saving vehicle will yield more returns, and even in deciding whether the leadership is managing the nation's resources effectively. We cannot run away from the subject. Therefore, in tonight's episode of First Issues, we continue in our bid to make the more commonly used economic terms less intimidating to the average person. And speaking of economic trends, let us recap as to what exactly we are referring to when we use this term, with the help of tonight's returning guest, former World Bank and International Monetary Fund advisor, Ita Mannatoko.
Well, economic trends basically is a term that is used to refer to the overall direction that an economy is moving in. Usually it describes the patterns that various indicators, economic indicators, show over time. These patterns tell a story about key areas of the economy, how things are developing in the economy, whether the economic climate is improving or not. So economic indicators are basically followed by people to determine the performance of an economy.
Last week we examined the Gross Domestic Product Indicator, more commonly referred to as GDP. In that conversation, Ita Mannatoko demonstrated how private sector GDP was inextricably and inversely linked to the real exchange rate, in that when the real exchange rate between Botswana and South Africa is low, private sector GDP shows significant growth. Therefore, tonight we consider this indicator that is of high significance for the local business person to better understand what the real exchange rate is and why it is one that we should pay more attention to. Welcome to First Issues. Welcome back to First Issues, as we explore the significance of trends witnessed within the real exchange rate. Most of us are familiar with the nominal exchange rate, which simply shows us the value of one currency relative to another. The real exchange rate, on the other hand, although related, is broader in the sense that it describes how many of a good or service in one country can be traded for one of that good or service in another country. Therefore, changes in the real exchange rate affect the competitiveness of traded goods. Our featured guest this evening elaborates.
If the real exchange rate depreciates or goes lower, it makes producing in Botswana, it reduces the cost of production for producers in Botswana compared to the cost elsewhere. So it gives a better cost environment to local producers relative to their competitors.
Back in 2005, the government devalued the pula against the rand, affecting the real exchange rate between these two countries. Many consumers, unaware of economic processes, may have questioned or even protested against these changes, and would most likely be interested to know what effect the devaluation had.
The effect of this was essentially, because there is a lag, the devaluation happened around 2005, but the effect of this was really to boost activity in the private sector. And growth in the private sector, the real GDP growth, jumped to 12.6 in 2006. In 2007, it was 17.4. This is in real terms, so this is significant growth occurring. And basically in 2006, 2007, and to some extent in 2008, the real exchange rate, once it had dropped, remained more or less at that level. So it supported that cost competitiveness for several years. But then after that, when you look at the real exchange rate trend, you'll see that it then appreciated, and so it eroded that competitive edge. and probably had some impact on GDP growth. In 2009, GDP dropped to 5%, 5.4 from 10.4% in 2008. And basically since 2009, it has never really recovered to the levels that it was previously. And currently it's at about 5.1% in 2013. It was at around 5.1%. But when we look at the trend for real exchange rate, you get a clearer picture as to what has been happening to the real exchange rate. When it depreciates, it provides a cost boost. And so when you see it depreciating, going down, you also expect to see some corresponding improvement in private sector growth. Whereas when you see it appreciating, it means it's becoming a little costlier relative to your competitors. And so you'll often see that the opposite trend for private sector GDP growth.
Seeing that there is such a clear link between a private sector growth and the real exchange rate, how is this rate determined and even managed? Ita says that in Botswana's case, the aim of policymakers has been to maintain stability.
Well, the real exchange rate policy is essentially determined by, as I understand it, it's determined by a committee, a joint committee of the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank. And the policy goal, as stated, is to maintain a stable real exchange rate. A stable real exchange rate means it doesn't fluctuate too much so that it doesn't cause an environment which is unpredictable for the private sector. And you don't want to plan to expand today and then costs have suddenly shot up next year, and maybe you've sunk certain money into certain things and you can't finish your venture. So you want some stability so that you can plan your investments. And so the idea is to maintain that stability. But I think part of maybe the debate in terms of what we are discussing is at what level that real exchange rate should be. So the government, I believe, tries to maintain stability, and hopefully they hope to maintain stability at a competitive level. However, sometimes maybe efforts to contain inflation or imported inflation, sometimes the pula, the currency, is allowed to appreciate in the hopes that that will reduce the extent of inflation that is imported, because what we import in terms of inflation from South Africa is a significant contributor to overall inflation in Botswana.
In economics, tweaking a policy in one area can have an undesired effect in another. The variables are that interconnected. In this instance, allowing the pula to appreciate means one thing for consumers and another for local producers of traded goods.
From the perspective of producers who produce goods which are traded, it's not so much the cost of living in Botswana in isolation that matters to them. It's whether they can produce competitively. So it's okay to reduce inflation. If you reduce inflation without allowing the pula to appreciate, then the real exchange rate will also reduce. So it's a benefit if inflation is reduced without doing it by causing the currency to appreciate. But if you are reducing inflation by causing the real exchange rate doesn't come down. And when it doesn't come down, it doesn't give that cost advantage to local producers. So it makes it more expensive to produce. So it's really more a policy management challenge I suppose. And there are different ways in which policy could be structured to try and address the challenge.
Which other ways can inflation be monitored or managed without the control of the currency?
If you're in a scenario where the main challenge is imported inflation, then the challenge is to design a system where you are able to keep the real exchange rate at a level which is supportive without having to do it by continuously allowing the currency to appreciate. There are ways that it can be done. It's always a policy choice what path the central bank chooses to do, but sometimes there are some who also, even within the economy, who want the exchange rate to appreciate, because for some sectors it's a benefit if the exchange rate appreciates. If I'm an investor here and I want to be able to periodically, I have external accounts as well, and
send money.
Yes, yeah. So I want to be able to not lose too much money through exchange rates and things like that. If in a sector where it's more consumption oriented, and I want to be able to import cheaply, because if costs are higher for producers here, it means that it's more advantageous to import, for outside. So if I want to be able to import more cheaply and I don't want to buy local product, then it's a benefit for me. So the government or the central bank has to look at where the dominant players are in the economy. I mean, which groups are the largest in terms of contributing to GDP, and then choose to allow the real exchange rate to be at a level which supports the majority. So those are the sort of challenges and balances that the policymakers have to make.
Welcome back to the show, as in this segment, we speak to different role players from within the film and television field to hear their 2 cents on the current state of the sector. Last year, the US government released its first official measure of how arts and culture affect the economy, and found that Hollywood and other creative industries add $504 billion to its GDP, the equivalent of 3.2% of US goods and services. Just next door, a 2013 study conducted by South Africa's Department of Arts and Culture found that their film and television industry alone, apart from the other creative industries, contributes about 3.5 billion rand a year to that country's economy. But it is more than just the numbers. The movies and art consumed around the globe create pure cultural capital for the producers of that material. However, we are not here to argue about the value of the film and television industry this evening, but to interrogate why Botswana is lagging behind in creating its own stories and material for both local and international consumption. Our first commentator is Tumiso Mabusela, an advertising executive and self-professed ideas man who has progressed from commissioning television commercials to venturing into documentary filmmaking. While giving us his views of the current state of our local film and television scene, he brings up the issue of the quality of materials being produced.
I think generally, it's a concern across the industry, film, advertising, design. There is a bit of a fragmentation in that you don't see a lot of collaboration between those that are involved. I think we haven't done enough to sort of build an industry where the value chains are defined. Because when you look at film, you've got script writers, you've got cinematographers, you've got cameramen, you've got all these people who work together to bring out a film or a TV commercial or a documentary. But what I've seen over the years is that you find that people sort of want to do everything. You find a production house that only has two people, a cameraman who also doubles as an editor, who also doubles as a cinematographer, and then that sort of brings the quality of what we see in our local industry sort of down. I think that's also the one thing that gets people not so interested in local production. Another thing I think the biggest challenge is talent development. We have lots of young people who've been to school in Malaysia and South Africa, but when they come back home, they find a situation where there is no industry. They can't find a job in a production house where they could sort of upscale what they learn or what they learned in school. So eventually they try to open their own little production houses, and they eventually sort of fail because one, there are no commissions. There's a huge problem in terms of funding, and also just the level of activity within the industry. We don't have film festivals. I think there was one that happened about 2 or 3 years ago, and I was kind of really excited to see how it's going to grow and how we're going to see a lot of young people and generally the film industry in Botswana come together to make it a success. But it's sad that it hasn't happened. I think last year there was a 48-hour film commission. These are the kind of things that help an industry grow. The more activity you have within that industry, the more that you start seeing lots of great work, the more you start seeing people interacting that are part of the industry. And when people interact, that's when you start seeing lots of collaborations. Collaborations then create lots of work and lots of great ideas that can come out and sort of grow the industry.
Our next contributor, Bokang Ditlogwa, television producer as well as media studies lecturer at the University of Botswana, is not completely convinced that networking and collaboration alone can achieve the desired results.
Even if the independent producers were to come together and work on a project and there's no finance, how do we ensure that they recoup the money that they spent in the production? Maybe only say 50, 60,000 is available for the production process to take place. And they have all the other resources, makeup artist, script writer, voice, and so on and so forth. And you have only 60,000 on the table. How do you invite other talents to come and participate? It will be difficult. The only thing that can happen is to produce a mediocre documentary, whatever. That's not world standard. Yet we have all those opportunities to produce high quality television and film productions.
Tsireletso Motagalwa is a scriptwriter and director who says he segued to print media and journalism because he was not making a living in the film and media industry despite his earlier involvement in big local projects. He says this litany of challenges is a result of the absence of a mandated structure necessary for the creation of a sustainable industry.
I think, first of all, you need institutional frameworks. I think you need a fund, film fund, or a commission of sorts that would then give us, the guide, kind of like the main conduct of what's going on. And once you do that, then you set the goals for that fund or for that commission to say, okay, the film commission will do this, and that. And then but it has to be a part of a national, I think, arts fund or arts council of sort, because all these things, film, video, all these things, theater, music, all these things are interlinked. So you can't develop one without thinking about the other. Then you have to work with a national broadcaster. In small markets like ours, a national broadcaster becomes, or even in small markets like ours. I think even if you go to Australia, you'd find that SBS, ABC, all those broadcasters have got a role to play in how the industry develops. So you have to give them the mandate, though. You can't just assume that they will do that, because maybe they don't. Maybe they have to cut costs. Maybe they don't have the budget to do that. But you have to explicitly say it. Say, in the mandate of the BTV, this is part of your mandate, and if they need funding, this is part of the funding for that. Please get back to us and tell us how you have managed to do that.
Mr. Ditoka does not decry a lack of policy to promote the growth of this industry, but rather a lack of implementation of measures that have already been put in place.
When you look at the whole picture of the production industry, it's not that the structures are non-existent. The policies are in place, but there's no implementation on the ground. Lack of implementation or maybe lack of know-how. I'll give you a very good example that can be used to expand or grow the industry and begin to realize the benefits that other countries are realizing as we speak. For instance, South Africa, they're actually making about, in the region between 5 and 7 million rands from the television and film industry annually. Why can't that happen in this country? If, for instance, the EDD, Economic Diversification drive, is to be implemented the way it should, then it will help the independent producers produce enough and bring more foreign income into the country. We badly need that, but because there are no support structures, that's why the industry, I'll say, is on autopilot.
Tony Tabona is a local businessman and notable patron of the film and television industry, who acknowledges that financing film and television projects is a challenge.
It's good to have an idea, but if you don't have the support system to help you run with it, it's really quite frustrating. You know, we would appeal for sponsorship, government and non-government, and you know, a lot of people want to jump onto a vehicle that's already moving than one that is standing still. So you'll find that the frustration is you have this brilliant idea, you know it can help grow the community, but then you need to struggle to get it up and running, you know. But like I said, fortunately for us, we do have the resources that have helped us to launch the 2 projects that we have in the last 2 years. And we only look forward to, you know, more support to come forth from the little bit that we got in the last 2 years.
Definitely food for thought. From me, Nameto Sibina, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, we wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.